Okay, I have to take a minute to talk about this. So, Stop Killing Games has been making headlines again as of late, as Ross and Co. are now at the point where they are actually addressing the European Parliament directly to start officially making their case, and that is kind of rad just on its own. However, naturally, around the same time as that, there was another somewhat related news story regarding a game made by Square Enix called Near Reincarnation, which was a mobile game that they released previously and was subsequently shut down in 2024, once again due to it having online components that they no longer felt like supporting. But as has happened so many times before with these sorts of games, fans have started to reverse engineer the game's networking components to try and create an offline version of the game that they can keep on playing despite it being shut down. And of course, this has somehow sparked some level of controversy, with some people arguing that they're infringing on Square's copyrights of the games. And I just have to chime in here for a second because I'm so annoyed by that kind of argument. Like, even putting aside the revival and the preservation aspect of it, I am always so frustrated whenever we have these insane scenarios where a company no longer officially sells a product at all, but still wants to get and throw a hissy fit when people try to access that product anyways through piracy. Like, I get it, these corporations hate piracy because they view it as losing sales, but when you stop selling a product entirely and there is no longer a legal way to acquire it through any means whatsoever, like, I'm not saying that they should lose the rights to their IP or anything, but they should certainly lose the right to complain when people start to distribute their own copies of that product that they're no longer selling anymore. If you want to complain about piracy, then you should at least be able to buy the game legally first. But that is a whole different topic that I don't feel like going deeper in right now. The more relevant topic for Stop Killing Games is another side of the argument that has been getting brought up again, which is the alleged extreme costs of turning an online game into an offline game. While Ross was speaking at Parliament, he sort of offhandedly mentions that the costs of preserving a game, especially when taken into account early on in development, are negligible. However, a few of the Japanese game devs that have been weighing in on this near discourse have been arguing that it's far more expensive than people realize. So, which is it then? It's easy to assume that the actual game devs in this conversation are going to hold more water, but I think there's a couple of reasons why they're maybe missing the point and not really estimating the right level of costs. And I think that if we do some rough estimations, we can see just how cheap the actual cost of preserving a video game would really be. So, to try and present their side of the story, according to some of the articles that have been thankfully doing some of the translating for me, what these devs have been saying are as follows. It's often not a viable choice for developers in terms of the additional work and cost involved to port a game into an offline state. Mechanisms that are essential for a game to function properly, such as progression tracking, inventory management, enemy behavior, reward calculations, among many others, are supported by servers in an online environment. Relocating these mechanisms so that they work locally leads to a plethora of new problems to solve, such as save file tampering, synchronization issues, and data inconsistencies upon resuming the game. Furthermore, games designed with multiplayer in mind have their difficulty, rewards pacing, and events structured specifically around that online play. So, converting them into offline games can require reworking not only connectivity related aspects, but introducing game pacing suited for solo play, enemy AI replacements, and reworking reward balance and save system design. So, okay, that was a lot, but the practical upshot that I think they're trying to get at here is that there's a lot of these systems in these online games that have tons of components that aren't even run locally. Like, what in an MMO, when you're doing a raid and you're fighting a boss, Most of the logic for that boss's behavior is usually handled server side so that they can ensure that it's the same experience for all of the players connected to that instance. So, reworking the game's code to actually run that boss data locally would actually take a fair amount of effort more than just porting the game to a single player mode. And that's just one system out of hundreds that might need to be refactored from the ground up in order to make an offline version of a game work. By the end, he argues that he actually once was working at a company where they considered adding end of life support for their game. But after going through the math and thinking about all of the man hours of work that would be required to make the game function offline, they determined that it would cost about the same as developing an entire new game from scratch. Now, I have two problems with this assessment. For one, that math just ain't mathin' for me. You mean to tell me that the amount of effort that it would take to refactor a game that is already complete, with all of its mechanics and systems already designed and created and implemented, with all of their art assets finished and in the game, that just modding that existing game would cost the same as making an entire new game from scratch with all new systems and mechanics and artwork that you'd have to re-implement and everything? Like, I'm not even arguing here that it would be easy to refactor all of that work, but to say that modding an existing finished game would take as much effort as making an entire new game from scratch just doesn't quite make sense to me, especially since the entire discussion that this is being born out of is from yet another example of fans reviving a project from the dead with a much smaller dev team than the original devs would have had when they made the game originally. Like, are the people making this near revival going to be a massive full-size AAA dev team? I don't think so. And we have countless examples of games like Cities of Heroes, Titanfall 2, Little Big Planet. Like, there are so many examples of fans managing to pull off these game revivals with seemingly small teams and virtually no budget that, like, I doubt it cost as much to develop these fan-run servers as it did to make all of Titanfall 2 or whatever. But the other issue with their argument is that I think they're working off of a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem and what people are asking for. They're primarily talking about this idea of converting an online game entirely into an offline single player game, taking everything that was run by the server and porting it into the client side version of the game. And that is, in fact, a pretty difficult thing to do for most games, and probably would be very expensive to implement. Maybe not entire new game expensive, but still an appreciable cost, I'm sure. But that's not what initiatives like Stop Killing Games are asking for. All that we want is for the game to be left in a reasonably playable state. It's purposefully left vague because they recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for every game in existence. So, like, yeah, for some games, there could be a way to preserve them that would mean simply removing all online connectivity and converting it into a purely single player experience. Like what could have happened with games like The Crew or that old terrible EA SimCity game from back in the day, where literally the only reason why it had an online component in the first place was mostly just for DRM to stop piracy. But for most other games like MMOs, or hero shooters like Overwatch or whatever, a more practical solution would be to allow for people to just host a private server, which would allow you to maintain most of your normal online functionalities just on a smaller scale. Like, you wouldn't have to rewrite the boss AI to work on the client. It still runs on the server like it would normally, and the client side would remain practically untouched. It's just that they would need to make minimal changes to the server networking code so that the community can now spin up their own servers and the developers wouldn't need to maintain them anymore. Now, some people might still argue that this could still be prohibitively expensive to implement regardless. Networking is complicated and hard, and converting a game from a dedicated server solution to community hosted private servers still might take a lot of work. But as I keep bringing up, there have been so many fan projects where a community has managed to revive a game from scratch entirely on their own, sometimes only taking a year or two to develop that, if that. So I doubt that it can really be that expensive to set up. And I mean, think about it. These people that are doing these fan revivals are usually working in the absolute worst case scenario possible. They usually don't have access to the game's source code, so most of what they do has to be reverse engineered from scratch, and they're usually working in small teams, if not as an entirely solo project, and they're usually working in their spare time, unpaid, while they deal with whatever other life obligations that they might have. So virtually every aspect of these fan revivals is made harder than it would be to do if it were to be done internally by the actual developers of the game with actual access to like the source code and whatnot. So, you know what? Let's actually try and estimate what the costs of these kinds of game revivals would be with some basic back of the envelope calculations. The idea is that you don't want to try and get the exact numbers right, but more try to estimate the right orders of magnitude so that you get a general idea as to the scale of the numbers you're working with here. Now, obviously, a lot of these fan revivals don't exactly have a budget, so I'll be working in terms of man hours to try and put some numbers into the amount of effort it takes to make these things while comparing them to the actual cost of a AAA video game. Based on what I can find, usually a lot of these projects seem to take around 1 to 2 years to complete. Obviously, it's hard to get exact numbers as every project tends to be unique, but that seems like a good baseline timeline to kind of work with here. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we're working around the clock 24/7, but let's be generous and say that these people, who I remind you are working in their spare time, let's say that they are somehow putting in an entire 9 to 5 equivalent 40-hour work week into these projects. I know personally I couldn't dedicate that much time to a side project, especially with a full-time job and other obligations to manage. But again, we are being generous here. And finally, let's say that it requires a team size of, I don't know, 5 people to pull this off. I know a number of these projects have been solo endeavors, but there have also been others that have nearly a dozen, like Titanfall 2's North Star project. Although, at the same time, not all of those people were actually working on things like the networking and private server creation part of the equation, which is what we actually care about here. So let's put all those numbers together. If we have a team of 5 people working 40-hour work weeks all year long, that gets us 200 man hours per week times 50 weeks a year gets us around 10,000 man hours of work per year. So for a project that might take 1 to 2 years to come to fruition, that's 10 to 20,000 man hours of work. And that's a lot of work, especially for a fan project that they aren't necessarily being paid for. But let's now compare that number to the cost of making a typical AAA video game. These days, AAA games have hundreds, if not thousands, of employees, but let's lowball things down to a nice 250 or so as the kind of lower end of what is generally considered AAA development these days. Now, obviously, as an actual job, I think it's fair to estimate that these guys are actually working a full-time 40-hour work week, and if anything, this might be a bit of a lowball since, I'm not going to bother taking into account things like the ever-present crunch culture that plagues so many AAA studios. And in terms of overall time frame, I mean, some of these AAA games take so long to come out these days. Big games like Concord and Starfield were famously in development for almost a decade at like 8 years long. But again, let's try to be nice and round down a bit. I think half a decade honestly seems fair, but let's round down even further to only around a 4-year turnaround for a AAA project, since that'll make the numbers a little bit nicer and easier to compare. So if we have 250 employees working 40-hour work weeks for 4 years straight, that gets us about 2 million man hours of work to make one AAA video game. Suddenly, the 20,000 hours of work that it takes to make the private server solution doesn't feel so bad anymore. That is literally 1% of the amount of effort that it takes to make a typical AAA game, if that. And again, I must remind you of just how generous I'm being with most of these numbers. Like, the estimation for the cost of making private servers are based off of the worst case scenario where people don't have access to the game's original source code or are working in their spare time while dealing with other obligations. It would almost certainly be far easier, cheaper, and faster to make a private server solution if you actually, have access to the source code for the game, as well as the original networking solution for their dedicated servers. Not to mention all of the access to the various professional resources and tools that would be at their disposal. So, like, I'm sure that you could argue that some of my numbers were a little off in one way or another. Maybe some of these fan projects take longer than 2 years to develop, or require even bigger team sizes to figure out. But again, this is already based on the worst case scenario, and even if you try to add on a little more to all of my numbers, no matter how you slice it, we're going to end up talking about literal fractions of a percent of a AAA game's overall budget. The cost of making private servers is so small that it could practically be written off as a rounding error. Other factors like inflation are going to be more impactful to your budget than private servers will be. Also, my estimation here wasn't taking into account the other less tangible costs of AAA development that don't translate directly into man-hour equivalents, like the cost of buying an ad spot on TV or at a big show like the Game Awards, or licensing out various bits of software, or renting office buildings, that kind of stuff. So, like, if you really want to argue that I lowballed the cost of making private servers, keep in mind that the cost of a game's marketing alone is often 25 to 50% of the game's overall budget. So you can practically multiply all of my AAA estimations by 2 for a more realistic budget if you want to go down that road. Like, sure, I understand that in reality, things are obviously going to be more complicated than just comparing a small number to a big number. They might have to contract out work to an outside studio, or hire an extra team to get it done, or maybe even pay for a new software license that includes private server support made by a third party. But regardless of how exactly the process goes down, I just don't understand how the cost of implementing this kind of solution to preserve a game past the end of its life could possibly impact the cost of development. Like, any features that you would have to cut due to a 1% increase in costs are almost certainly so minor that nobody would notice them missing. And, like, let's be real here, studios and publishers waste way more money when they're overpaying executives tens of millions of dollars a year anyways. Like, if a studio really starts to complain that they're going to have to cut costs and fire tons of people in order to implement an end-of-life plan for their live service game, just keep in mind that they could have done so by just taking some cash out of that massively over-bloated salary that the C-suite has, instead of laying off another 100 employees. Oh, and if you're worried about the indie side of things and how this would impact independent developers, I wouldn't be. Like, keep in mind that all of these estimations are for reverse engineering AAA networking code, which is naturally going to be a hell of a lot more complex and intricate than anything that a smaller indie studio is going to make. And for that matter, when you do get a multiplayer indie game, the vast majority that I've seen at least tend to use private servers already just by default. Games like Satisfactory, Terraria, Space Engineers, etc. Like, if an indie game doesn't use entirely community hosted servers, it's usually something that's on the way or very trivial to convert it into a state where they can. So, like, at the worst, it seems like this problem scales to the scope of the game, since so many indie games don't seem to have issues with making games that can comply with Stop Killing Games already. So, yeah, and it is also worth pointing out here towards the end that even the developer that originally was making this argument in the first place already admitted that if you come in from the start of development having an end of life plan for your game from the start, then that alone can dramatically reduce the cost required to implement it, since you can design the game systems from the ground up and how its networking is going to work with that in mind. And Stop Killing Games isn't trying to be retroactive. It would only apply to games that start development after it becomes a law. So nobody is going to be forced into that worst case scenario of having to go back to an older game and try to figure out how to reverse engineer and retrofit it to work without their dedicated servers. Although he does argue either way that this will somehow limit the kinds of games that you can make, but this is another common argument that I see pop up repeatedly that I just don't understand. Like, what mechanics and systems are we talking about here that can only exist in a dedicated server solution? Like, there definitely are some for sure, like matchmaking, for example, and having a ranked online system that keeps track of everyone's skill levels to match them up accordingly. Like, these kinds of things generally do need widespread, dedicated global servers in order to pull off. But when we're talking about preserving a game, these are also the kinds of features that we can cut for the sake of just making the game playable without a dedicated server. Same with stuff like microtransactions. Like, you need dedicated servers in order to manage payments and stuff, but there's obviously no reason to keep it up all of that payment information and keep selling skins and hats and stuff in a game that the developers themselves aren't even supporting anymore. So, like, they may as well just make all of that content free for everyone to access, and then it's no longer a problem anymore. But more importantly, none of these systems that I'm talking about that actually require, like, dedicated online functionality, none of these things really affect the core design of the game. Whether you have access to a competitive ranked mode or not doesn't change how you design Tracer's gun in Overwatch. Like, these systems that require dedicated servers to manage generally don't affect how you design the core gameplay itself. The closest example I can think of off the top of my head for a game that does actually use online systems to sort of affect core gameplay is Helldivers, because the whole Galactic War system, like, updates dynamically in real time as a community-wide system, and that affects the kinds of planets you can access and what the main goals for your missions are and some other various modifiers that might affect your gameplay. But, like, even then, like, those systems don't really directly affect core shooting gameplay. Like, they might apply temporary modifiers, like giving you extra stratagems or spawning more of a particular enemy type to fight, but that's not really stuff that actually requires a dedicated server to make it happen in-game. Like, if Helldivers died tomorrow and they had to take all of the Galactic Warfront stuff out of the game for the sake of preservation, you would still have the core gameplay loop of dropping onto a planet and shooting aliens and calling in nukes and other stratagems and stuff preserved in its entirety, and you could even just have a randomized event selector so that you can have those modifiers still appear in the game without the need of those dedicated servers and the Galactic Warfront. Stop Killing Games recognizes that you cannot preserve literally every aspect of every game that was ever made. Like, the feeling of walking into a town in an MMO for the first time and seeing dozens, if not hundreds of other players just milling about, doing their own thing. Like, that's not even like a mechanic that's coded into the game. It's just kind of the nature of that genre, and there's obviously no way to really preserve that, even if you can still play the MMO after it's been shut down. But as they say, perfect is the enemy of good enough. Surely preserving what we can of these games so that people can continue to play them decades from now is at least better than tossing them out entirely just because you couldn't preserve every single aspect of those games entirely. And with that, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. What did you think of that first big parliament hearing? Like, I'll admit it's a little bit dry, it is politics after all, but it was also weirdly engaging to see all of these government officials seemingly responding very positively to what Stop Killing Games was saying. Like, I do recommend at least skimming through the highlights, if not watching it in full yourself, if you're curious to see how things are progressing. It's at least a lot more entertaining than most government meetings. But for now, if you like the video, make sure to leave me a like and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this in the future. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.